Welcome to another edition of the News Review. In this edition, Russia has slammed France and other Western states for their recent decisions to ramp up military support for Kiev, warning that such measures could deepen the suffering of Ukrainians. The Kremlin spokesman has reiterated that Western arms deliveries cannot and will not change anything on the ground. Dmitry Peskov says such moves would not deter Russia from achieving its goals either. Last week, France and Germany announced that they would send light combat vehicles, including tanks, to Kiev to help it fight Russia. Ukraine, which has scored some battlefield successes in recent months, had asked its Western backers for heavier weapons. Moscow, however, has time and again warned that Western leaders are prolonging the conflict by providing weapons to Ukraine. To discuss that more, we're joined by our correspondent Johnny Miller, joining us live from Crimea on the grounds there. Marcus Papadopoulos, historian, political analyst, and author, is also joining us from London. Let's begin with our very own Johnny Miller. First, if you could please give us an update. What's happening there? What is the latest?
Well, at the moment, we're seeing some of the most fierce fighting of the war so far around Bakhmut and Soledar. Reports are coming in now that the Ukrainians are withdrawing from Soledar, which is a significant victory for the Russians. If they're able to take Soledar, which it looks like they are, it'll close the net, if you like, on the strategically important city of Bakhmut in the Donbass region. But Ukraine is trying, and NATO, of course, are trying their very best to hold on to Bakhmut, which is why we're seeing some of the most fierce fighting. Dozens, most likely hundreds of soldiers being killed every day in that region. Russia is also certainly suffering serious casualties as well, but we expect the Ukrainians are having a harder time because of Russia's overwhelming artillery superiority. So this battle for Bakhmut, if you want to call it that, a very significant event that's going on right now, but it is Russia that's moving forward.
Okay, so Marcus Papadopoulos, considering what's happening on the ground now and the fact that Dmitry Peskov has said sending more weapons to Ukraine cannot and will not change anything on the ground, could you elaborate what he means by that?
I should like to say, first of all, that in recent days, the Ukrainian defense minister said something that I and others have averred ever since the commencement of the Russian military campaign in Ukraine. Namely, the aforementioned minister said that Ukraine is carrying out NATO's mission against Russia, which in simple English means that Ukraine is fighting NATO's war against the Russian Federation. Accordingly, I welcome the candor of the Ukrainian government concerning the reality of the war in Ukraine. And naturally, Western mainstream media chose not to report on the words of the Ukrainian defense minister, which is yet another reason as to why we can consign British mainstream media and Western mainstream media to the gutter. Now, turning to the status on the battlefield in Ukraine, there are numerous factors accounting for why Russia is winning the war and why the Russians will emerge victorious in the war. One such factor concerns Russia's military-industrial complex. The Russian military-industrial complex, which has its origins in the Soviet period, is tasked with and is capable of sustaining the Russian armed forces in a protracted war with the United States of America. It therefore follows that the Russian military-industrial complex is more than capable of sustaining the Russian army in Ukraine. Whatever losses the Russian armed forces have incurred in terms of military hardware, the Russian industrial military complex can replenish those losses very, very quickly. A second factor concerns the vast territory which the Russian army controls in Ukraine, which stretches from the northeast in the Kharkov oblast down to the east of Ukraine in the Donbass and across the south of Ukraine. Indeed, Ukraine has lost most of its Black Sea coastline. And a third factor concerns the grievous losses that the Russian armed forces have inflicted on their Ukrainian counterparts. And I am not just referring to losses which have been incurred by the Ukrainian side since the start of the Russian military campaign in Ukraine. I am also referring to the colossal losses that the Ukrainian army has incurred at Soledar and Bakhmut. Those losses do not amount to hundreds of Ukrainian soldiers killed in action or wounded. No, they amount to thousands upon thousands of Ukrainian soldiers killed in action or wounded, to say nothing of the amount of Ukrainian hardware which has been destroyed by the Russians at Soledar and at Bakhmut. So in short, Russia can win the war in Ukraine and will win the war in Ukraine because Russia is a military superpower and because the Russian military industrial complex is more than capable of fighting a war against the Ukrainian army, bearing in mind, as I said earlier, that it is tasked with fighting a war, a protracted conventional war against America.
So, Johnny, you just heard what Marcus Papadopoulos said. I would like to hear your analysis, particularly with respect to the fact that Russia has clearly said that whatever kind of military aid to Ukraine will only prolong the war.
Well, yes, I agree with much of what your other guest says. I think one of the saddest things about this war is that NATO seems absolutely determined to do all it can to try and win when the odds are stacked against them. Of course, living standards are now dropping in European countries. European industry is struggling because of high energy costs, because of this war, because of the sanctions on Russia. But NATO, instead of being concerned with the living standards of their own people and their own economies, seem absolutely determined to win this war against Russia. But as your other guest says, Russia is in a very strong position at the moment. It's mobilized 300,000 soldiers recently. It's also playing a delicate balancing act between only moving a part of its economy onto a war footing, but it can certainly mobilize a lot more people, a lot more of its economy to the war effort if needed. But on the other hand, it's also difficult to see what a win for Russia looks like. Many people in Russia now saying that the only way they can end the war, if NATO continues to support Ukraine militarily, the only way Russia can win is to ultimately enact the full surrender of Ukraine. And of course, Ukraine's still a large country that Russia would be very happy with most of the territory that it's got at the moment. It would like to take the rest of the Donbass region. But what's the saddest thing for myself is that there's very clearly a peace negotiation to be had. I've spent months in Donbass, and I can tell you the Russian-controlled areas of Donbass, I can tell you the vast majority of people there no longer want to be part of Ukraine. Ukraine has been shelling them for 8 years. I've been to the funerals, spoken to the people, been under the shelling myself. And the vast majority of the people there want to join Russia. In the southern regions of Kherson and Zaporozhye, it's more mixed. But there is a peace negotiation to have. There is a way to end this war. But of course, that would mean ceding territory to Russia. And there seems to be an effort to try and persuade the European people that there's no way out of this war except to continue to supply weapons to Ukraine. There is another way out of this war, and that's at the negotiating table and by listening to the civilians on both sides of the battle lines.
Exactly, and that's a key point, Marcus Papadopoulos, listening to the citizens of both sides and what they want. And Russia did conduct a referendum there. We did see that the majority of the people in the eastern Donbass region want to be part of Russia. So tell us, what is the future for Ukraine? What is your analysis and prediction?
Anyone who is familiar with Russian history and anyone who is familiar with the Russian official mindset And the mindset of the ordinary Russian knows that Russia and the Russian people will not stop with the Donbass and Zaporozhye and Kherson. The Russian government and the Russian population as a whole are intent on eliminating NATO's presence throughout Ukraine. Accordingly, the Russians will either absorb all of Ukraine into the Russian Federation or most of Ukraine into the Russian Federation. I often ponder just how far west in Ukraine the Russian army will advance. Sometimes I'm of the opinion that the Russian army will capture the westernmost oblasts of Lvov, Ternopil, Ivano-Frankivsk, Volyn and Rivne. Sometimes I feel that the Russians are of the opinion that absorbing the aforementioned territories into Russia could be problematic because it is only in those regions where anti-Russian sentiment in Ukraine is found, because historically those regions were controlled by the Poles and the Austrians for hundreds of years. But I have no doubts that the Russian army will at the very least advance all the way to Vinnitsa Oblast and Zhitomir Oblast and will absorb those oblasts into the Russian Federation. And also at some point, and I would say sooner rather than later, the Russian military will commence with an almighty offensive in Ukraine. And I suspect that that offensive will be carried out on numerous fronts in Ukraine. And it is conceivable that the Russian army will capture the Ukrainian-Polish border, will split Ukraine in two by entering the oblasts of Vinnitsa and Zhitomir, and also the Russian army will capture Kiev, and they will do those three things simultaneously.
Thank you very much, Marcus Papadopoulos, historian, political analyst, and author from London, and our very own Johnny Miller, live from Crimea. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and views with us on this edition of the News Review. And thanks to all of you viewers for watching this edition.